Again, we are continuing, of course, the vote counting. It's the day after the local government elections. Now let's go to the Western Cape, which is said to be the second province with the most counted votes. To look at that situation in the province, we're joined live now by my colleague, eNCA reporter Ayesha Ismail from the Provincial Results Operations Centre in the mother city. Ayesha, good afternoon. Well, it looks like there's more progress there being made counting-wise. What's the latest you can tell us?
So, Dan, what we know so far is that about 50% of the votes have been counted in this province, and we're seeing that the Democratic Alliance is ahead of the pack at the moment, but of course it is still early days. But the one thing that people are still talking about is the fact that there was a low voter turnout yesterday. Now, I'm now joined by Professor Jaap de Visser from the Dalla Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape. Professor, we were talking earlier about the low voter turnout. What do you make of this?
No, I think that the low voter turnout is something that should concern all of us, and it calls for introspection within political parties, within the IEC, within government, and I think within all of us, to ask questions around why the turnout was so low. We're not going to go anywhere near, I think it was 48% in the last elections. We're not going to reach that at all. We're going to sit much lower, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that we need to interrogate a bit further.
So last night at about 11 o'clock, the IEC in the Western Cape had their last press conference, of the day yesterday. And we heard that there was, at that stage, they were talking about a 36% turnout, and that is pretty low. Is there a possibility that the outcome of the results could be questioned on a legitimacy basis?
There's no legal threshold for the voter turnout. So legally, it's not going to be a reason in and of itself to challenge the elections. Of course, election outcomes may be challenged, and I'm sure there's going to be some objections lodged with the IEC. There may even be a court case. But the issue of the voter turnout is not in and of itself a reason to legally challenge the electoral outcome. However, I do think there's a debate that needs to be had about why is it so low. And what does it mean about politics? And also, what does it mean for the incoming councillors? My argument is that maybe we should see this not as a positive, but give it a positive spin, in the sense that councillors that are incoming should perhaps adopt a bit of a humble stance, that yes, they have won the elections, but they're coming in on a mandate that is not overwhelming, because it's based on very few voters actually casting their votes, only about 12 million. And there are many, many South Africans that have not voted. So I think it calls for humility on the part of politicians that are now entering these councils.
Now, when we asked the IEC officials yesterday what they attribute the low voter turnout to, they were citing the bad weather. They were talking about power outages, and also, the fact that it was a long weekend, and the fact that a lot of people decided that they were simply not going to go out and vote.
Yeah. Of course, there are many, many reasons, and we need to look into that more closely. The IEC will point at logistical challenges that they had, the weather, cable theft, and all the things that you mentioned. I think the absence of the usual voter registration drives, I think, have also played a major part as a result of COVID. The IEC could not do what it normally does, which is have these massive voter registration rallying weekends. IEC's budget has been cut drastically over the last couple of years by Parliament, so they had fewer manpower, fewer resources to make these elections happen. And of course, I think the biggest question is what has made potential voters, turn away from the voting process altogether. And I think in this regard, it's important to note that in terms of our constitution, yes, we are a representative democracy. Our democracy functions on voting, but also a participative democracy. So even when councillors have been voted into office, that doesn't mean that they can now lean back and do whatever they want to do with that mandate. They must still reach out and consult citizens, and not just those that voted for them, but also those that didn't vote for them, or that didn't go and vote at all. And I think that is now all the more important, because there are so many people that actually didn't participate in the voting process, but still have a right to be heard when municipalities take decisions.
Yesterday, when I was out and about and talking to people on the ground, a lot of them were saying they didn't go and vote because, there's this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And people were saying, what's the use of going out to vote because nothing's going to change for us. After the elections, we will still be poor. After the elections, we still won't have jobs.
That's the most disconcerting part of this discussion, I think. And I think if the numbers, if we have to look at the numbers of the voter turnout, it seems that in middle class and the wealthier areas, voters turned out. But in the poorer areas, voters did not turn out, and the voter turnout was very low in the poorer areas. And even though, arguably, people in the poorer areas have the most to gain by change in politics and better service delivery, but clearly those voters, those potential voters, are disillusioned with the political process. And I think that's something that we should all be concerned about.
But how do we remedy the situation going forward? We can't have people, in large numbers simply just sitting back and saying, we're not going to participate in democratic elections.
Yeah. Of course, it's an issue of civic awareness, in schools and education, and we must, impress upon everyone who has the right to vote to go out and vote, and we must continue to do that. But I do think there's a job to be done by politicians to really make sure that they bind the voters to them once again, and that we start seeing politics that is not just about bickering and fighting and the politics of the belly, but politics that really centers around service delivery, and particularly at local government level, where it really is not about the big fights about who controls parliament and who's going to be the next president. It really is about what are we going to do in this town, in this municipality, with the limited resources that we have. How are we going to extend service delivery into poorer areas and make sure that everyone, and not just the wealthy, benefit from what municipalities' programs are.
And local government elections are often referred to as, dealing with bread and butter issues. Yet when you speak to people in poorer areas, they don't even know who their ward councillor is. Often the ward councillor will only come around, a month before the local government elections.
Yeah. Look, our ward councillors, most of them are party aligned, so they run on a party ticket, and they are party politicians in the first instance, and perhaps ward councillors in the second instance. And I think that's obviously something that plays into this. We also have a lot of independent candidates, but interestingly, they're not doing overwhelmingly well, even in this elections. We have more independents. We'll probably end up with more independents than we had in the previous term, but independent councillors are clearly not attracting that many votes. One sort of, I think, very practical issue in terms of the law is people have been asking the question, why is it not compulsory for a ward candidate to live in his or her ward? Because in our system, you don't have to live in your ward to stand in that ward as a candidate. In fact, you can stand in as many wards as you want, just to grab votes wherever you stand. So maybe there are also some technical changes that we can make to bind these candidates more closely to the ward from which they are elected.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. And that was Professor Jaap de Visser from the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape.
Thank you very much, Ayesha, there at the Provincial Results Operations Centre in Cape Town.